They didn't have fridges, spices were gold, and meat was rare, yet medieval cooks still pulled off mouth-watering meals on a peasant's budget. Here are cheap medieval dinners you'll wish you knew about way sooner. So we're going to start our list off with pottage, which used to be one of the best things to get in medieval European food culture. There's a lot to go over here. Simply put though, pottage was something that was a hybrid between a soup and a stew. You had a few grains, vegetables, and sometimes protein like fish or meat, but this would change depending on how well off you were, what areas you were around, and what the season was. The word itself comes from a French word known as pottage, which simply refers to anything made in a pot. This is actually a very prehistoric dish because it existed way before the medieval times ever occurred. It had roots in Celtic and Germanic traditions of pot-boiled grain-based food, and the Roman dish pulse was one of its earliest forms. Pottage, as such, has no set list of ingredients or rules to really adhere to. Adaptability is arguably the one trait this dish doubles down on the most. It's supposed to be something you can make with whatever is available to you, no matter how bare bones or abundant that is. While typically people do try to have an even balance of grains, legumes, foraged ingredients, and meat, there's no preference for any specific kind of grain or meat over the other. Bits of pork, intestines, brain, veal, chicken thighs, pinto beans, anything would work. It's also why this dish was able to exist in so many different cultures. Everyone could truly put their own spin on it. Barley bread is one of the oldest kinds of loaded breads that you can find in European history. It's completely medieval and has a history that goes back thousands of years. This is because among all the grains in the world, barley is arguably one of the first that we ever domesticated. It was first cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, which, if you don't know where that is, it's the area that covers modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Barley bread was one of the most common kinds of bread in the early Middle Ages, and it went onwards towards the High Middle Ages as well. This was typically considered to be a peasant bread, though. It had a coarse texture, it was darker than other breads, and it did not really have enough gluten. It was hard bread because of that fact. It was actually a bit of a sign of your economic class if you were constantly having barley bread, because only the rich people would get to eat fluffy white loaves of bread like we're used to. If you've ever had split pea soup or peas pudding, then you might be interested to know that it actually originated from peas porridge. It was a dish that was really high in calories, but it was also really filled with protein. This was even better for people growing up because back in the medieval times, if you did not happen to live near any huntable game or were not rich, you could simply forget about having any kind of meat. The taste of this was still okay enough without it, but it was better when there were bits here and there. It's actually something that most people thought was really comforting, and it was why people invested in growing peas. Peas were convenient because even cottagers and small-time families could start to grow them. When famines would hit, peas were one of the kinds of legumes that could grow even when other grains simply could not. Cabbage and onion soup was a medieval recipe that's pretty much stayed consistent with how we have it today. It was something that involved a watery, thin soup made out of spices, water, and some aromatics, and brought to a boil gradually. This would be done in earthen pots over a campfire, and it was one of the most perfect things to have during winter. While the preparation is largely the same across several centuries, the convenience isn't. As time went on, we obviously developed many things to cope with the long and harsh winter months, but on the flip side of things, when it was medieval times, people really just died in the winters, mostly out of hunger. Crops simply would not last, would not sprout in time. Some of the crops would fail, the land may simply go barren, or you may just not have damaged crops from rodents. Any one of these uncontrollable, unpredictable circumstances could essentially just ruin your entire year. Cabbage was important because it was very easy to store in the winter. As far as the nutrition goes, this is pretty okay when it comes to making sure you get everything you need. Comparatively, it was a lot better than other kinds of soups because it could be made very easily. The more convenient it was to make a dish, the more it would be preferred among the people, especially if it was very easy to grow it. Cabbage could also be used to make a lot of different kinds of things, so it was always worth it to invest in them. Onions were a very reliable vegetable because they were one of the most essential flavorings. The food back then was typically bland, and they didn't have the means to make it any tastier, but stuff like this helped a lot. Poor people would have very limited options for food back then. While you might think that since there weren't any taxes, jobs, or grocery store price bumps to worry about, that doesn't necessarily mean it was easier. They had to rely on whatever they could forage, whatever they could grow, and whatever was easiest to buy. Oat gruel was a dish that basically became synonymous with being down on your luck because of this. Oats have, for centuries, been the silver lining in a deeply hungry and bad situation for a lot of people. But that was especially true during medieval times. Oat gruel is pretty much prison food too. Ever see those shows where the guy gets a porridge-looking slope of food? That's pretty much it. While it was nutritious and it had protein, the biggest reason people ate it was because of the amounts of fiber present in it. It would keep them full for much longer in the day and lead to less hunger pangs, but it also meant that they were continuously losing body fat without being able to make too much muscle. We're really starting to explore the deep end of medieval countryside cuisine now, so I hope you're still tuned. Our next item happens to be turnip stew, which is a textbook example of how people got their nutrition in those times. Potatoes were not actually the most widespread ingredient like they are today. It used to be turnips. This was especially true for Europe, where potatoes arrived by the 16th century. Turnips were favored because they could be preserved very easily in root cellars for winter. They were really easy to grow in poor soils, and they were hardy. Also, this was one of the few crops where even its root was edible. It wasn't a dish that had a lot of guidelines to follow, so in that respect it was a lot similar to how pottage worked. People would throw in whatever herbs, roots, aromatics, and scraps of meat and protein they had. One of the best things that would go along with turnip stew if it was available was beetroot and eggplant, which might be a surprise combination for you to hear, but was actually fairly common back then. The word Maslin actually ends up coming from mestillon in Old French, which means to mix, and that's exactly what Maslin bread is. If you wanted an idea of what a medieval mixed loaf would look like, then look no further. It was very common to see this in England, France, and the Low Countries, especially between 1000 to 1500 years. Maslin was one of the most common kinds of bread for a specific reason, and this is actually because the climate was decently different in medieval times. Wheat was something that was born in more humid climates, so it struggled in northern and upland areas. Rye was a lot more reliable, on the other hand. It was known for also producing a darker bread that would keep you full for longer. People would get whatever wheat they had, mix it with rye, and get this loaf that was dense from rye but fluffy and soft from the wheat. It was a very interesting kind of loaf, really, and while we have several mixed grain breads in today's time, this was one of the easiest ways to spice up your daily routine back then. In medieval Europe, fish and root vegetables were the most common thing for a majority of the population. Most of them could not afford to sustainably get meat every single time they went out for grocery shopping. It was also something that was really preferred by religious followers of the church, although I can't really imagine a specific reason why. For root vegetables, I can see veganism being something a well-intending church appreciates, but then why the meat? If there are any history buffs in the comments, let us know. Now, the dish itself would change a lot. This would heavily depend on the kind of climate and geography you were working with. Coastal regions, like along the North Sea or the Baltic, for example, had a dense ecosystem of marine life. They had herring, whiting, haddock and cod, salmon or crabs, and people would often just work with whatever the catch of the day was. These fish would be salted and dried as much as they could, both for inland trade and for winter preservation. Root vegetables were also dearly important to people because they were one of the few kinds of vegetables that could withstand poor soils and still last through the winter. One of these vegetables was the iconic carrot, and here's an interesting fact. In medieval times, you actually had purple and yellow carrots instead of orange. Lentil soups were even more common in the medieval world. They would change a lot depending on the region, though. For example, in Europe's southern regions like Provence and Spain, lentils were not only used to feed humans, but also to feed animals. Lentil pottages were one of the most important meals for the church as well, because when the fast would break, this was one of the few meals that could feed an entire group and still be very easy to prepare. Lentils would provide an incredible dose of protein, and it would need just water and a few other vegetables if you could spare them. Onions, leeks, and garlic, or just some savory or sage would work really well. In the Middle East and North Africa, lentil soups were something else entirely. Medieval Arab cookbooks like Anwa al-Saidala f Alwan al-Atima would feature all kinds of lentil recipes with an incredible amount of flavorings, seasonings, and spices to make it stand out from other dishes. It would be a lot more bombastic and flavorful than European versions of the same dish, and if looking at today's world is any example, I think it's historically accurate to say that they've always had us beat when it comes to working with legumes. Next on our list, we have boiled beans with garlic, which was an incredible staple across Europe, especially among monks and peasants. While peasants liked it because it was one of the few affordable things that they could get, monks liked them because of the sheer simplicity and health benefits. It kind of makes me feel really bad about how much unnecessary junk I eat when I do videos like this. These beans were one of the primary legumes that would be grown in medieval fields, and one of the most common ones were fava beans. These had become pretty native to the Old World, and they were even older than much of the beans we use today, like pinto, kidney, or black beans. Fava beans were incredibly resistant and tough, and they could work through the winter very well. They also did amazing whenever you would mix them in with garlic. It was one of the most affordable seasoning plants, and it could grow in climates that were otherwise too rough to support much crop growth. People kept it for medicinal purposes, as a flavoring, and as a last resort meal too. It was very common for Italian dishes in that era to feature sage, olive oil, and garlic as primary ingredients in most dishes. Monastic communities also relied on boiled beans and garlic, as it became a particularly good friend in their endeavor to sustain meatless diets forever. Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles, and maple syrup. Another one you might be surprised to see in a video about medieval-era recipes is honey and oat cakes. Oats were really common in northern and western regions like Ireland, Scandinavia, and Scotland, and this was because the climate was really cold. It was much easier to grow them than, let's say, wheat. Oats were something that would thrive in poor soils, and they also had shorter growing seasons, which meant that they became a pristine source of food when times were tough and you were running low in your pantry. A very basic oat cake would typically be made from coarsely ground oatmeal, water, and some salt, and this mix would be made into a slightly hard dough, rolled very thin, and then cooked on a baking stone. These were durable, portable, and crispy, so they were the perfect meal for long journeys. Alongside some honey, which was the primary sweetener before sugar, it was one of the best meals you could have for celebrations. While people did use them in their daily lives, rural peasants most often got to enjoy them during festivals and religious holidays in monasteries. It's also interesting to note that honey was seen as a bounty of the earth that carried divine favor, and so honey and oat cakes were seen as a good blessing for wedding feasts. Hard cheese and bread is one of the oldest and most memorable pairings from the medieval period, and bread and cheese were some of the most core meals for people back then. It wasn't even a specific group of people, it was almost everyone. monks, shepherds, travelers, nomads, farmers, fishermen, peasants, and even citizens. Bread would be made using whatever kind of grains were possibly available, and they were the typical ones we have gone over so far. If you were rich, you would just be eating wheat, and that was always a dead giveaway that you were rich too. The class disparity back then was pretty black and white. In the middle and lower classes, as they existed back then, you would get to see several different kinds of breads, like dark and rough ones, or fluffy but dense ones. Hard cheese was something that was favored over other kinds of dairies because it could be stored for a very long period without spoiling anything. Cheesemaking was something that was an extremely rural activity, and it was practiced in all kinds of homes, monasteries, and farms. Milk from sheep would be curdled via rennet and pressed, then salted and aged to make firm cheese. It was a practice that would go on throughout France, Switzerland, and even England. Rabbit stew is pretty self-explanatory. It's, well, rabbit stew, you know? I'm just kidding. It was a lot different from the stews we might be used to seeing today or even 50 to 60 years ago. Hunting wild game such as rabbits was how people lived off of the land, and making these stews would ensure enough food to last the day and give everyone 2 or 3 square meals. What people would do is add as many herbs, aromatics, and vegetables as they could. They took a very different approach to cooking. Some of these spices, like cumin or black pepper powder, may not necessarily have gone the best with rabbit stew. They were still added for any perceived medicinal benefits, though, like digestion and gut health. Back then, people were so used to eating whatever was available or whatever would keep them full longer. If it would taste good, that would be even better, but something tasting good was never a priority. Hunting rabbits was something everyone, from kids to adults, would be involved in, and villages and communities would set out traps for miles to capture as much game as they could. Black bread and ripping is one of those dishes that may not have any specific, notable history with it, but one that says something about the people that make it. First, let's start with what black bread is. It was the everyday bread of the citizens and rural folk of Northern and Eastern Europe. From Russia to Scandinavia and Poland, black bread, this distinctly dark, coarse bread made out of rye, bran, and maslin, was an incredibly hard bread. It would stale quickly, and back then, they didn't even have that many preservatives. Still, it was one of the few kinds of sustainable breads people could make with the grains they had. So what were they to do? People were going to adapt, that's what. And adapt they did. This is where dripping comes in. It's just lard, by the way, but it would transform the texture of the bread. What was just a hard and rough loaf of bread would suddenly soften, become warmer, and become a lot better to bite into. The crispy brown pits in the roast pan would have been mixed in, and they really added to the vibe of the dish a lot more. The dripping flavor would also be different depending on what kind of animal people would use, and pork dripping was the most common one. So, there you have black bread and dripping, a dish that reminds you of how people will find any way to get by. Salted fish and porridge is an example of an essential combination in medieval times. It was especially popular in coastal and northern regions. This is because preservation was a massive deal in those areas due to how they were always just dealing with rougher, colder climates. Also, it might be surprising, but fish was a religious pillar for people. The Catholic Church back then was the reigning religious authority, and it would impose all kinds of fast days, especially every Friday. See, here, any kind of meat was forbidden, except fish. The logic behind this is that the practice of fasting during Lent and on Fridays is to abstain from fleshly meat, but since fish are cold-blooded, they don't come into flesh meat. It's a technical exception. The porridge itself was something that would contrast very well with the fermented taste of the fish, and in some households, people were adding herbs, onions, and garlic as well. This was a dish that was always eaten out of necessity. Apple and nut porridge was a delightful, nutritious dish that would be somewhere in between everyday food and a celebratory treat. Now see, porridge was something that had a lot of colorful variations in the medieval world. Typically, it would be made with oats and millet, but if that wasn't available, then people could also just use different kinds of grains like rye or barley. During harvest season is when the party would really get going, though. That's when people would have abundant access to fruits and nuts, and that's when porridge could be turned into something significantly more special than what they were used to. Wild and homegrown apples were incredibly reliable. They would thrive in pretty much most major European countries. Apple orchards were something that would be seen in most village commons and monasteries too. Apples would be chopped, sliced, and simmered until they were just a little bit sweet, and nuts would be crushed and stirred into the porridge. This was a great breakfast, but if you had honey, some warm spices, and a bit of cream, it was something fit for a feast. Curd cheese with herbs is a really good example of how even the simplest of ingredients and medieval-era foods could be turned into perfectly nice snacks or lunches. Curd cheese was also known as white cheese, and it wasn't like hard cheese. This one was much more readily available and quicker to make. You would curdle the milk with rennet and vinegar, and then you would drain all the way to leave a really soft and fresh curd. This was extremely common in households where dairy herds and weekly cheese making was done so that milk could be prevented from spoiling. Europe also, interestingly enough, had different names for this depending on what areas you would find yourself in. Places that largely spoke German, for example, would call it quark. It was known as brocue in certain parts of France. Also in urban homes or wealthier ones, curd cheese would be made with spices and served with fruits for a nice little sweet and savory twist. Baked apples with honey were such an incredible medieval dish that they were especially for any kind of party or celebration. The baking was always done near the fire or a hearth oven, and the dish was incredibly simple. It really was just an apple that was baked whole with honey drizzled over it, or sometimes they would simply dip the whole thing in honey. People would also boil the apples first and then bake them to get a dish that resembled the texture of apple pudding as we know it today. This dish was eaten at the end of a course or as a fast day meal, and honey and apples were things that you could eat on days where you had to fast. The combination of a softened, decadent apple mixed in with caramelized golden honey was something that scratched all the right itches. Baked apples with honey had an incredibly strong association with festive and seasonal meals, and they were particularly really popular around harvest and Christmas. Apples were abundant, and honey was something that people could spare sometimes for the right kind of occasion. This dish is something you see in medical texts, estate records, cookbooks, and other medieval-era references. Apples were also prized because of how easy they were to store. Baked turnips with herbs is an example of how even a simple and humble root vegetable can be turned into something that gets your kids at the table if you know what you're doing. Luckily, medieval-era cooks had a lot of room for trial and error, and they definitely learned a few things about working with turnips. While baking them was never as common as stewing or boiling them, it was extremely good. Households that had the privilege of a bake oven would abuse that luxury maliciously, in fact. That's just how nice it was. In households where that wasn't a thing, turnips were typically wrapped in kale or cabbage leaves and then baked in ashes or at the edges of a hearth. This was a pretty rustic method, but it would help to soften the turnip, and it let the herbs introduce some much-needed flavor. Of course, you had to be very careful that what you were doing wasn't going to burn the turnips. Monasteries were most commonly known for preparing turnips, and they relied pretty much entirely on olive oil and butter. This resulting dish was something that was really earthy and savory, but the herbs helped when it came to the taste of turnips. For some, that taste can be really overwhelming. Onion tarts were naturally one of the go-to meals for people, given how important onions themselves were in times like these. But one has to ask, what really is an onion tart? A typical medieval tart would basically start with a coarse flour crust. This would be made from the typical rye, barley, and Maslin mixes we've seen so far, and that's how the pastry was made. This would be a vessel for the filling, which would be made out of parboiled onions and butter. These softened onions would be mixed with herbs and then enriched more with eggs or fresh cheese, whichever was available, or both, if you were doing well. This mixture would then go into the shell of the tart, and it would then be baked until you would get a lightly brown surface. In southern Europe and the regions that are now France and Germany, this dish was the predecessor of dishes like onion pies in modern times. This was a pretty herbal-tasting dish that carried the flavor of onions over almost perfectly, and it was something people would rely on when they wanted an open-faced, savory treat. Mushroom and herb stew is a medieval dish that's pretty timeless. It's still something that a lot of people bring to vegan parties whenever they can. Today, mushrooms are pretty much a gourmet ingredient, but in the medieval period, they were regarded as wild food. It was pretty typical to spend your day foraging at the edge of fields for mushrooms, and laborers who worked in the woods or fields would rely on them all the time. Medieval people had an intuitive knowledge of a vast variety of mushrooms, especially the ones that were available locally. Field mushrooms, also an ancestor of modern-day button mushrooms, morels, chanterelles, and other kinds of wild types were all things they worked with. They were also pretty smart. While they didn't exactly know why certain mushrooms killed them, made them sick, or caused them to see things, they knew to avoid those and how to spot them out, and that's what let them have mushroom-based dishes as a part of their diet in the first place. Mushroom and herb stew was a seasonal dish that was prepared during the late summer to autumn seasons, because this is the time where mushrooms would be the most available. The herbs that people would use were typically marjoram, thyme, and parsley, and winter savory was also something people thought worked with the natural earthiness of mushrooms extremely well. Among peasants, this was a stew that was valued for its umami flavor, and it's something that they would make regularly. Garlic and leek broth was something that small-town dwellers would eat a lot. They were both reliable crops, and if that wasn't possible, they were both quite affordable. They were essential plants in almost every kitchen in most European countries. This broth in particular was valued in most communities because of its restorative properties. You ever had a broth or a soup that really just makes you feel 10 years younger again? Yeah, it was that kind of thing. Broth itself was really simple. Leeks could be sliced and cleaned, and then they would be crushed. And both of these would simmer in water, a light vegetable stock, and the broth could pretty much be flavored with salt. It could also be packed into pots and taken as a portable dish. Fresh or dried herbs like parsley, marjoram, and thyme were wonderful little additions to this dish. This isn't a dish that's unique to Europe either. It's a recipe that's seen in Chinese medieval cookbooks, Byzantine recipes, and many traditional recipes from Islamic countries. Almond milk porridge was a very common dish throughout the medieval times. It was something two groups of people would use very regularly. One, it's something you would always see in a wealthy person's pantry. Almond milk was seen as a luxurious kind of milk, and the cost of almonds was high. Second, it was common amongst Catholic citizens who were fasting on Fridays. Animal-related products would often be banned during fasts, but almond milk was just plant-based. It was a lot more typical to see it in monastic kitchens and in cities rather than anywhere outside of that. The porridge would be made by simmering the grains until they were soft and thick, and then almond milk would be added in and stirred so that the dish could become smoother and more rich. People back then would grind blanched almonds into pastes and then steep them in water. They'd strain the mixture through a cloth to produce the liquid, and the leftover pulp was something people would use in cakes and other desserts or for more porridge later on. It was a pretty comforting and refreshing dish. Spiced cabbage and lentils are the perfect place to end our list on because this was pretty much the daily meal for a lot of medieval-era folks. During lean seasons, cabbage and lentils were valued even more for their nutritional value. Cabbage is something you already know has cemented itself as one of the most reliable vegetables on the planet. Lentils weren't as common as peas and broad beans were in Europe, but they were a complete sensation in the Middle East and South or Southeast Asia. A typical meal would basically just look like boiled lentils until they were tender, and after that, the cabbage would be chopped and boiled as well. Once this was done, people would add leeks and garlic for flavor, and they would throw in whatever warm spices they could. For townsfolk, this dish was a total godsend. It was meatless, it gave protein, it filled you up, and was full of vitamins. Even if generally most people didn't understand why this was a nutritional meal, they understood that it was extremely good for them. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. Osgood pies were the height of America's experimental phase of adding all kinds of fruits like pecans and raisins to the mixture and using them as fillings. Single-crust pies and simple ingredients equaled a pie that stuck to traditional flavors but did them really well. Hanging close to your roots and nailing the execution is the story behind many great recipes across history, and Osgood pies were no different from the rest in that regard. Adventurous. Ever tried hot Dr. Pepper? This warm beverage was made by heating Dr. Pepper and adding lemon slices. It was used in the war days to warm up your insides during the cold winter months. Say goodbye to hot cocoa, cause hot Dr. Pepper was all the rage back in the day. It was pretty simple to make. All you had to do was heat the soda to 180 degrees in a stovetop saucepan, then pour it over a thin slice of lemon. It was introduced by the brand to increase sales during colder days when no one wanted a chilly soft drink. Smart marketing, don't you think? So, why did this drink disappear? Well, people just stick to the cold serving of Dr. Pepper now, and I'm not complaining. In Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. Vinegar pies shook the baking world up at the start of the 1970s as bakeries started serving the odd pie across the states. Bakers began adding vinegar to the dough whilst also using a vinegar filling, topping it off with whipped cream. Bakeries did this because the vinegar gave the texture of the crust a pretty noticeable glow-up, while also adding a unique tartness to the pie. Usually, apple cider vinegar and brown sugar would be used to balance each other out, and the aroma as well as the set of flavors made this a holiday favorite. Everyone can remember their grandma enthusiastically coming out of the kitchen with a fat vinegar pie on Thanksgiving, right? For Americans who wanted to be whisked away to days when they were 7 and nothing mattered except hearing the school bell ringing, this pie was the one. America found other ways to have nostalgia trips eventually, and vinegar pies are now just a forgotten classic. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. If you're a fan of pineapple on pizza, you would have loved this next one. While we're on the topic of rice, my personal favorite, rice pudding. A sweet reminder that nothing should go to waste, especially not leftover rice. In the era of the Great Depression, where every rice grain was counted, families found a way to turn yesterday's leftover dinner into today's sweet dessert. Rice pudding became the ultimate budget-friendly treat, transforming something simple into something comforting and sweet with just a little sugar, milk, and a dash of cinnamon if you were feeling particularly fancy. I know leftover rice seems kind of blah, but once it simmers into something that looks and smells like pudding, you'll forget what you were even talking about. Plus, it was an easy way to turn ingredients you had into something new, which saved you money and a trip to the store. It felt like a real treat even in lean times, and that's why it was so popular among families. A warm bowl of rice pudding could brighten up the end of any meal, turning frugality into a moment of indulgence. So even though it started as a way to cut food waste, it stayed a family favorite that warmed up even the coldest hearts in those freezing times. If you think the beef heart is off limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Before we leave the South, let's talk about fried pies, which sort of blur the line between a fried pocket and a pie. Pie crusts that were fried and filled with various fruit or cream fillings became incredibly trendy in the South. Actually, most things battered and deep-fried tend to come from the South, so there really is no surprise here. Your mind might be thinking this would not work and that the flavors are too different, but it actually clicked. Folks from outside those parts of the USA also would pick these turnover-like pastries, enjoying the harmony of fruits and fried dough. Fried pies gave people a similar feeling to eating a chocolate donut, since sometimes they would be filled with chocolate. Currently, it is just a forgotten Southern legend. Sadly, since America moved on to healthier pies. Meatloaf. Who doesn't love this classic comfort food? But what happens when you get a sweet craving and add a little twist to it? Well, you get meatloaf with brown sugar glaze. Meatloaf is a traditional German, Scandinavian, and Belgian dish, and it is a cousin to the meatball in Dutch cuisine. But a brown sugar glaze? That's where things got exciting. This dish was a culinary experiment of the Way days, and it's safe to say it was a huge success. Every continent came up with their own variations of this dinner, and it became a centerpiece at every dinner table. It was basically combining ground meat, breadcrumbs, and spices, topped with a caramelized brown sugar and ketchup glaze. What could go wrong with that? Meatloaf is still a staple for most people around the world, but you don't really see it get paired with a brown sugar glaze anymore. It was just a post-war craving, I guess. While on the topic of soup, let's not forget to mention onion soup. And since it is fall and fall is the soup-making season, maybe you'll get an idea or two on what to make for your next dinner. The onion soup was proof that even the humblest ingredients could make a delicious meal. In case you didn't know, when you're working on a tight budget, onions become your best mates. They were widely available and quite cheap at the time, so they were the go-to vegetable in hard times. When you mix a few onions and some broth, even if it's just water and a bouillon cube, you'll get yourself a soup that's rich in flavor but light on your wallet. The thing that makes onion soup such a classic and timeless meal is its simplicity. Though caramelizing onions takes a bit of time and patience, they add a depth of flavor that makes you forget you're eating something as simple as soup. Once they hit that sweet golden spot, there's no coming back. With just a few ingredients, you can create something that feels gourmet, even when times are lean. But we can't forget the bread and cheese. No onion soup is complete without them. Traditionally, a slice of bread and a sprinkle of cheese are broiled on top. But even without this fancy finish, onion soup remains a delicacy of this time. What fascinates me about onion soup is that it manages to make an ingredient such as an onion the star of the show, making it into a bowl of comfort that feels like a splurge, even though it is not. And so do our feathered friends. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. In America, so many communities live together that often one will borrow from another, and such the case with funeral pies. Why do they have such a depressing name? Well, the pie was most often seen at funerals and was given to families as a consolation food. Most people agree that it got its name from how often they were seen at funerals. However, what we do know is that among the Amish community, these were not an omen of a deceased relative, but a sign of a delicious evening. Also, they continued the trend of spices and raisins being used in pies. Funeral pies eventually even made their way to southern USA cuisine, but today, even at a funeral, you would not find this. Canned luncheon meat was like Spam's less famous but more generic cousin during the post-war days. It was another affordable protein source that was readily available everywhere. It was used in sandwiches, salads, or simply eaten on its own when no other resource was around. It was also a good choice for big households when wallets were too tight back in the day. It was an instant hint in the States and made its way to other parts of the world before it became a pantry staple in Europe too. I mean, what's not to love about a cheap, easy-to-make meat option that's easy to store and prepare? But let's be honest, it's probably best left in the can. Unless you're a fan of processed meat flavor, I know I'm not. Hogshead cheese is one of the more bizarre meals on the list. Okay, before you jump to any conclusions judging from the name, this meaty meal doesn't contain any cheese or any dairy products at all. This unique delicacy originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. So, if not cheese, what was it actually made of? It was basically flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold at room temperature, or in a sandwich. This dish was popular in the post-war era as it made use of every part of the animal, reflecting a time when nothing went to waste. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It has disappeared from our dinner tables and menus, and I don't think this one calls for a comeback. Corned beef and potato hash was a true Depression-era hero. It was affordable and filling. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by, corned beef in a can was a lifesaver. Corned beef and potato hash was a shelf-stable, cheap, and stretchy meal. It was a dish that kept bellies full without keeping the wallets empty. The beauty of corned beef hash was in its simplicity. Fry up some chopped potatoes, toss in that canned corned beef, and let it all get crispy in the pan. Adding an onion or two added a bit of spice, but not everyone had that option available. But even if you couldn't afford onions, the combination of corned beef and potatoes was just enough. It was a meal that tasted like you put way more work in than you actually did. It was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed the whole family and still leave enough for leftovers the next day. Corned beef and potato hash wasn't just a Depression-era staple. It was proof that you didn't need fresh ingredients or fancy cooking techniques to make a hearty, filling, and tasty dish on a budget. Now, this is one meaty dish. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to know why this one has vanished from our tables. I bet you're not up to the task of hunting a bear, are you? Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Continuing on with more desperation food that actually worked, we have buttermilk pies. What if we told you pies could be tangy, sweet, and extremely cheap? Buttermilk pies were one hell of an all-rounder in the 1970s because they gave you everything for like $3. All you needed were very simple staples of any pantry and some vanilla custard paired with a butter pie crust. Sometimes, if people could spare the money, they would get some lemon zest juice and sprinkle a few drops to boost the tang of the dish. This pie was a favorite of so many homes and a regular of birthdays, parties, celebrations, and holidays of all kinds. Ask your parents to take a trip down memory lane to their favorite foods, and we will bet you money they will mention this. When times got much better, people made fancier and more complex versions of this pie, but the OG still stands on its own 2 feet, even if it is gone now. Creamed chipped beef on toast, often referred to as SOS, was a popular military meal that made its way into civilian kitchens. Now, this one was equal parts comforting and questionable. Think of it as dried beef, reconstituted into a creamy, salty sauce, and then plopped on top of toast. It's like someone tried to make a fancy grilled cheese, but accidentally ended up in the Weird Food Hall of Fame. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's definitely a unique flavor profile. It was also known as fizzled beef and was served as breakfast in many diners across the US during the post-war days. And it wasn't just limited to toast. Chipped beef was also often served on bagels, English muffins, biscuits, home fries, rice, mashed potato, and in casserole. Some people even tried flavoring it with Worcestershire sauce. Yeah, now we're talking. This one's faded from our dinner tables but hasn't been able to escape our memories just yet. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. Green tomato pies might take your taste buds for a spin, since you might have rarely heard of or tried this pie. In reality, though, when made with summertime spices like cloves and cinnamon, they would take on a very fruity taste similar to apples or rhubarbs. In the 70s, green tomato pies were such a chic and in choice as far as your evening dessert plans went. Combined with their apple-like notes, they were called the apple pies of the summer in that decade. The 1970s had a whole spectrum of food, from experimentative train wrecks to simple knockouts. Green tomato pies were somewhere in the middle and did find a fan base, but not one strong enough to last into the new age of today. Corned beef hash was pretty much a mix of corned beef, potatoes, and onions. Corned beef, also known as salt beef, was popular in most Commonwealth countries during both the World Wars. Although the exact origin of corned beef is unknown, it most likely came about when people began preserving meat through salt curing. This dish was a practical way to use up leftovers and stretch food supplies, and was often served for breakfast or dinner. The best part? It was very filling at a very low cost. It is also the ultimate hangover cure before, or at least it was before, people discovered avocado toast. But let's be real, nothing beats a good plate of hash when you're craving something satisfying. Tracing back to soups for a second, I forgot my favorite one: potato soup. A true staple for when you're on a budget and trying to feed the crowd. With just a few spuds, I can never say that word and not think of Ross dressed as Spudnik in that Halloween episode of Friends. Never mind, allow me to continue. As I was saying, with just a few spuds, some water or broth, and a little milk or cream, you can whip up a pot of creamy soup that will make you feel like you're eating something fancy. Potato soup is as simple as it gets, but that's why everyone loves it. Plus, if you throw in a few onions and carrots, my dears, you've got yourself a true delicacy. Ooh, and don't forget the toppings. Cheese, bacon bits, and green onions can really jazz this dish up. And as all of you probably know, potato soup tastes even better the next day, once all the ingredients get a chance to, as I like to say, get to know each other better. I don't know about you, but this soup is my favorite even today, when it's not made to stretch the family's food budget, but rather to bring some nostalgic feelings around the house. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. Sugar cream pies were in a league of foods called desperation pies. Popularized during economic perils, sugar cream pies used very few and simple ingredients, which made them accessible to just about any Americans. Sugar cream pies involved a custard filling that was not made with eggs, and at the top of it you would have appetizing cinnamon sugar sprinkled onto the cake. Since they used so little but fed so many mouths, you can imagine how good of a choice this was in hard times. Especially during the Great Depression, where even stuff like sugar and flour was hard to come by, but humans need to have their sugar rush needs satisfied. Pies like this one were a great way to do that. But they did not last much longer after that era, and by the 70s disappeared completely. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. Another great thing about this meal is its versatility. Got any spices lying around? Throw them in. A sad, lonely veggie waiting to be declared garbage? Throw it in too. It is the meal that will adapt to whatever you had in the house, not the other way around. It always manages to come out tasting like you put more effort into it than you did. Plus, let's be real. When you've got a pot of beans simmering away and some rice cooking on the side, it smells like home, which is what people at the time desperately needed to be reminded of. The beauty of bean and rice is that it is not just a survival meal, it is a comfort food packed with nutrition. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others, not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue, because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though, because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Chess pies are similar to both Osgood pies and Jefferson pies, but they leave out the meringue and creamy toppings for an even fundamental flavor profile. Simply put, chess pies are all about taking the basic ingredients that make a pie and nailing them completely. The most liberty this dish takes is some vanilla and tart lemon juice, which we mean, come on, we just talked about literal fried pies. A very do one thing but do it right type of pie. It was an incredible choice for gentlemen who love to go to parlors and pubs for a round of chess. As you can guess, that is also where it got its name, because they would order chess pies over a few rounds. Today, both chess pies and the game it gets its identity from are things that were much more popular in the 70s. At least it was memorable. If you're a fan of pineapple on pizza, you would have loved this next one. Pineapple and cheese salad was a unique delight back in the day. This dish came into existence when someone decided to mix pineapple and cheese together in times of misery. Imagine cubes of pineapple in a creamy cheese mixture. Terrifying or finger-licking delicious? There's no in-between. This was a variation of the infamous candle salad, which was a vintage fruit salad popular in America in the 1920s and was typically composed of lettuce, pineapple, banana, cherry, and either mayonnaise or cottage cheese. This was considered a luxurious delicacy during the tough times of the war, but just when fresh veggies were hard to come by, this simple, affordable dish made its way onto many kitchen tables. Creamed peas on toast. Yuck! Sounds terrible to me, but maybe some of you will disagree. In hard times, this was the go-to meal for families looking for something hearty without draining the pantry. Canned peas, some butter, flour, and milk, and you had yourself a creamy sauce that could turn a humble slice of toast into a meal. I know it doesn't sound glamorous, but creamed peas on toast were the purest form of comfort. You didn't need fancy ingredients or hours of prep time. Toss the peas in a quick white sauce, pour it over toast, and voila, dinner is served. It was filling and warm, with just the right amount of creamines to make you forget that it was actually a can of peas and a piece of toast. Creamed peas on toast came with a great bonus. It was quick to prepare, making it ideal for those nights when you were hungry but didn't have much to work with. It won't win you any culinary awards, but creamed peas on toast was a no-fuss comfort food that got the job done. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. Bear meat might seem like something out of a survivalist's handbook, but it was once a prized delicacy in many cultures. The roast loin of bear was considered a special occasion dish, reserved for feasts and celebrations. This dish has deep roots in the culinary traditions of the early American settlers. As you can imagine, hunting a bear was a daunting task, so this meal was a reward for bravery. Apart from the hunting of the bears, this one wasn't complicated to whip up. All you needed was the loin, which is the tender strip of meat along the backbone, which was often roasted over an open fire. PB&J sandwiches ran so peanut butter pies could run, and boy did they dash. Around 1975, strangely, a craving took over the masses for peanut butter in all things they were having. Now, pies were never too far off on the horizon, and America was already brainstorming in the kitchen often enough with all kinds of fusion foods and different cuisines. Peanut pie itself was widely eaten in America already, so the stage was completely set for the birth of the peanut butter pie. Hitting bakeries around towns around 1976 and onwards, these double-crust pies filled with very thick and creamy peanut butter were heaven on a platter. Often families would go way overboard with the amount of filling, but who could blame them? Combos with peanut butter would keep continuing in America, and although this one did really well, it would soon get overshadowed. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were once a lunchtime favorite. Liverwurst, or liver sausage, is a kind of sausage made from liver, so it was the perfect meal for when no part of the animal could go to waste. There were very limited meats available during the World Wars, and people had to use whatever they could find, including livers and hearts. Liverwurst was often spread thickly on rye bread and topped with thinly sliced onions. This sandwich was very popular in Europe and different parts of South America such as Argentina and Chile. I don't know about you, but the combination of iron-rich liver and pungent onion doesn't sit right with me. It was like a flavor explosion in your mouth, but not in a good way. I'm pretty sure this sandwich was invented as a punishment, but people really had to make do with whatever they could find back in the day, and this dish was just a result of that experiment. Now that's some blast from the past. Comment down below which dish should be brought back, and don't forget to like and subscribe.